Katie, we can't hear you.
There we go. Let's start this again. It's been a while since I've done this, so hello everyone and welcome to our Winter 2025 Weed Inspector Land Manager webinar. My name is Katie Makahonyuk. I am the Plant Health Technical Advisor for SARM Division 4, which is Northeast. Most of you probably know me already. I've been around a long time. Today I want to welcome Corey Jacob. He is the acting provincial specialist for weed control with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. He's going to be talking to us about enforcing the Weed Control Act. If you have any questions while the presentation is going on, there's a nice little box in the top right-hand corner of your screen, hopefully. It's got a little question mark in it, so just click on that and you should be able to enter in your questions. We'll go through them all after he's done his webinar, and hopefully he can answer them for you. So anyway, I guess we can get going if you're ready, Corey.
Yeah, I'm ready. Do you want me just to share my screen then?
Sure.
I just don't know where that option is. I need to.
Okay, I will make you a presenter. There we go.
Okay. Okay, Katie, just are you seeing the slideshow or this with the next slides?
I see the next slide.
Okay, I need to just sorry about this. I just need to change around my displays. I'm hoping that's just going to take care of the problem.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, do you see the slideshow now, correct?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, then we will we'll get the presentation rolling here. So I just want to say good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Katie, for the introduction and for the opportunity to give a bit of a presentation on enforcing the Weed Control Act. So to start with, if any of you don't know me or have had me speak, I've been acting in the weed control specialist role for Clark Brenzel now for about 1 year and 6 months. Well, he's off on sick leave and hopefully getting healthier. So I've been doing quite a fair bit of learning and had some coaching and mentoring from Clark too along the way. But anyway, just gonna get along here with talking, and we'll address any questions or concerns at the end of the talk. So there we go. So just gonna cover the history of regulating weeds in the province. So we've been regulating weeds here for a very long time in the province. It started out with the Noxious Weeds Ordinance, ordinances of the Northwest Territories from as early as 1883. Then that, of course, turned into the Noxious Weeds Act, which was passed into law in 1909, shortly after we became a province in 1905. And the most recent version of the Noxious Weeds Act was in 1984. So, in that period of time, that was kind of our legislation. Now fast forward to December 1st, 2010, that's when the Weed Control Act came into force. So it'll be celebrating its 15th birthday here in December of 2025. So along the way, we've been regulating weeds for a long time in the province. I mean, some of them were brought over as ornamentals with the, with our ancestors or the homesteaders, but it's been a problem here for, since we were a province, I would say, or farming or whatever you want to call it, since we had settled here. So what is the Weed Control Act? The Weed Control Act is a provincial law that places responsibility for weed control on landowners or the occupant of the land. The Crown is not bound by the act or the legislation. It's an enabling legislation that gives powers to local municipalities for the enforcement of control of regulated weeds on private land, focused on prevention of introduction and further spread. It establishes weed regulatory priorities based on the prevalence within the province and gives a clear direction, excuse me, on intensity of enforcement based on the species, on what species it is and the size of the infestation we're dealing with. So our legislation for weed control in the province, it has 3 parts to it. One part that we're discussing is the Weed Control Act, which provides a core of required activity standards and municipal powers and responsibilities. There's the weed control regulations, which cover some additional definitions and information that aren't in the Act. So it talks about maybe domestic animals, maybe machines. And as well, it covers the agreements and orders that as a weed inspector you would be using if you need to write an agreement. Those also can be found on Saskatchewan.ca, and searching for weed inspectors, that will also take you to some agreements and forms, like a template that we have on the website. As well, the regulations cover the maximum amount of that municipalities can recover from landowners for costs measured for costs of measures taken with the agreement or order that weren't complied with. It covers the maximum amount of deposit that municipalities can require with the request for an appeal, as well as additional acceptable means of service for documents under the Act. And the third piece of legislation is a minister's order that designates the different weeds, so prohibited, noxious, and nuisance, so that the weed lists for each. We are working to update the prohibited, noxious, and nuisance weeds under a minister's order right now, which will take some time. But again, it's one of those, we open it up and look at it once in a while, but it's, I think there's been a need to update it for quite some time, especially since the Act came into force, coming on to 15 years ago. So within the Weed Control Act, a cornerstone of it is the 3-level weed list, right? So we've got our 3-level weed list based on early detection and rapid response. So the idea that we're going to detect these weeds early if they're not established here, and we're going to move quickly or respond rapidly to control them so they don't become established here, causing other issues. So we're going to take care of them early. We have 3 categories of regulated plants that we use here in the province. We use prohibited, noxious, and nuisance. And other jurisdictions such as Alberta, they use restricted, noxious, and nuisance. Montana uses a class 1, 2, or 3. And Manitoba uses tiers 1, 2, and 3 to identify the different classes of weeds, right? So it's an obvious reflection of weed species severity and the level of attention needed to address the problems. As well, it allows enforcement, dictated by the level of concern. So prohibited weeds, eradication. We want them scorched earth, gone. We don't want them here. Noxious weeds are a little more well established, so we kind of focus on containing and controlling them, or maybe eradicating small isolated populations, maybe like the size of an office room or a small room that can be managed and eradicated. And our nuisance weeds, that we would say would be like a change in land management practice to reduce the problem, maybe integrated weed management or integrated weed control or some agronomics to help to manage that problem. So a lot of this early detection rapid response invasion cycle is based on this this graph that comes from Australia. So on the bottom of the graph, it focuses on time and weed introduction here, and the longer we let the weed become introduced and established, the infestation level goes up. And it becomes so well established and at a higher infestation level that we can't actually control that weed species or eradicate it. Control becomes not possible unless we're going to be throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars or larger amounts at it. So it's better to control a species, like if we can prevent it from becoming established here, right, with square nose knapweed or Palmer amaranth. If we do let them become established here, like with spotted and diffuse knapweed and field scabious, they're still at a low infestation level that it's easy enough to control them. If we act on it a little bit slower and let them become established, we move to like a containment and control where we contain the spread and control it from there for for example, leafy spurge and wild parsnip. And if we wait too long, the weeds become too well established, for example, dandelion and Canada thistle, where we have to kind of go into coping because we're never going to get them under control or eradicate them in the province. It's an issue that's gotten too large and too well established. Of course, the model also talks about the economic control of return. There's a higher return if we control them easier. So, 100 to 1 or 25 to 1 return before letting the weeds get established here. And that's basically, $25 to every $1 spent. So it's a very large return if we can act quickly, on weeds before they become established here. Containment and control is about a 5 to 10 to 1 return, and a 1 to 5 to 1 return if we go to coping. So very little return if we're more reactive than proactive. As well, where our weeds fit, so our prohibited weeds would fit under prevention or early detection. Our noxious weeds would fit under containment and integrated control. And our nuisance weeds are more coping. That's where they kind of all fit when we talk about this this invasion graph or chart, however you want to call it. We've talked about that. Now, I think it's important to also touch on the role of the weed inspector. The primary role of the weed inspector is to enforce the Weed Control Act, period. Now, I think it's good to also, for you to read the act. I mean, it's not overly long. I think it's 19 or 20 pages. It would be good to read the regulations too in the weed list, but start with the actual Weed Control Act. It's written in pretty plain language, and just give it a read over so you at least have a broader basic understanding of what's in the act and what's required and requested of you as a weed inspector in an RM. Of course, also primary role is to ensure that infestations of weeds are controlled in the RM. So that could be private, corporate, or municipal, landowners, and also reporting to your RM council at the end of the year, or if they want to be reported to every quarterly or every 6 months, what's going on in the RM for weeds and weed control activities. Secondary role would be, coordinating municipal weed control activities, so monitoring for regulated weed infestations, mapping, doing records. Records may be very useful if you want to use IMAP invasives. Of course, we can, the app can be downloaded onto your smartphone, onto your iPhone or Android, and you can get the RM set up with an account if they don't already have one. As well, there's assessing the effectiveness of controls and plan for future activities. So assessing if you did spray a patch of a weed, did we eradicate it? Do we need some follow-up control? Did we find this weed somewhere else? So just assessing that. If you're participating in biocontrol activities, right? So where does that fit into your RM's weed management plan? So collecting the biocontrol agents and storing those as well. And really being kind of the eyes and ears for advising the RM administrator and council on weed issues in the RM and giving them some, advice on how to deal with them or what's going on, right? You're the eyes and ears for weeds and weed control in the RM. As well, I mentioned about 18 months I've been acting in this role, and I've on numerous occasions I've had people, assuming or had the confusion around the weed inspector role, and assuming that the weed inspector is also the pesticide applicator, and this isn't necessarily true. The weed inspector is not required to apply any pesticides if they don't want to. They're not required to, but they can apply pesticides if they want to, if they have the appropriate training and licenses. Any weed control training clinics, right, that doesn't qualify for a pesticide applicator's license, the weed inspector can only apply, herbicides or pesticides, especially herbicides, with the industrial pesticide applicator's license. So that's the home study license program through SAS Polytech. So again, you can apply to that and do that if you want to, but it's not required for the weed inspector. But if you want to be the pesticide applicator, you're welcome to, but it's not a base requirement. As well, being aware that if you, as a weed inspector, are the pesticide applicator, excuse me, it might be seen as a potential or conflict of interest as the weed inspector as well, because you would be the pesticide applicator or have a herbicide application business. And as the weed inspector, you might just start writing orders to give yourself quite a fair bit of work as the applicator. So just being aware that it could be a perceived conflict of interest, but also making sure you walk the line and you make sure you're not crossing it for personal gain as a conflict of interest would be based on. As well, a weed inspector is not the the whole or overall authority of the RM, right? The position doesn't give them authority to, to carry weapons or authorize you the ability to detain somebody or destroy property, right? You're the weed inspector. It gives you certain, certain enforcement powers, but not to go to this extent. Of course, you need to be appointed by your RM before you can really enforce the Weed Control Act. So your RM, as many of your RMs do, would be sending a notice to our Crops and Irrigation branch that you've appointed this person as the weed inspector, emailing, scanning physical signed copies of your letterhead to crops, at gov.sk.ca. We don't do the physical copies of the weed inspector ID cards, but I believe we do email out the card still. And the RM or weed inspector can print out and cut out the card if they wish to. As well, the RM that has you appointed will appear on the Weed Inspector in Saskatchewan page, which can be found on saskatchewan.ca if you search Weed Inspector. And this is the map here of if you search that, the map of what you get to. This is from 2022, but it basically shows you the municipalities that have weed inspectors appointed in the province. Now, I know this is a few years old. I need to update this, but it shows you the yellow dot here is the urban municipalities that had weed inspectors appointed. So Yorkton, Springside, Lumsden, Moose Jaw, Strasbourg, Hodgeville. Highlighted in the green are the RMs that have a weed inspector appointed in that year, in 2022. And the white RMs did not have a weed inspector appointed that year. So again, I think we've made improvements to have more weed inspectors appointed in the province, but there's always RMs that don't appoint a weed inspector or don't let us know that they've appointed one. And on the right here is what the card looks like that we use when we're setting the weed inspector. Their appointment's been recognized with, by the ministry, and it's in accordance with the Weed Control Act. That's what the cards look like, and I don't think they would change too much. So when we go through the enforcement process, there's 4 different steps to it. So there's investigating or consulting with the offender, the agreement or the order, following up, and then reporting. So first off, it's the investigation or discovery part where you typically this would be triggered by a complaint by somebody in the RM or a ratepayer. You never want to identify to the offender who that person was. As well, you could also do an investigation through normal monitoring where you're driving or you're walking and you see something going on or something suspicious for a weed infestation. You want to contact, if it's through a complaint, you want to contact the complainant to determine the location of the weeds. Also determining who owns that land, who occupies it. Going to that location, you have the right as the weed inspector to go to the location, to enter that land, and to confirm the identification of the weed, or to your best knowledge, confirm it. Collecting evidence, right? So photographs of that weed, of the infestation, the location, as well collecting, the weeds or parts of the weeds for if you want to mount them or to get expert identification. We here can help to identify the weed. I don't want to use the word expert, but we can work and do our due diligence here to make sure we're identifying the weed, to make sure it's a prohibited or maybe it's a misidentification. I also would just ask or mention, if you're collecting parts of a weed, some weeds can be, they can be toxic if you're not using gloves or if you're not maybe wearing a long sleeve shirt. So be careful. Some weeds do give off a sap, or they've got different protection mechanisms. So just be careful that you're handling a weed properly and you're not putting yourself at risk of harm as well. Once you've collected evidence, then you've identified who the landowner is, you would approach that landowner or occupant, talking to them about what we found on the land, and really starting to develop an agreement with them that, okay, we need to control the weeds. This is why we have to control it. And then making sure that they're on board, and hopefully it can be solved simply that they agree to control the weed or the weed infestation. So you're obligated to first, as the weed inspector, to first approach the landowner or occupant basically with the intent to negotiate an agreement to control if it's a noxious weed. Because an agreement is basically a contract between the owner occupant and the weed inspector saying, I'm the owner of this land, I will control this weed, with a herbicide or tillage or whatever would work the best. We start with an agreement, and an order is only necessary when the owner occupant refuses to negotiate the agreement or follow it through, right? Or the weed inspector must attempt to visit the owner occupant's usual place of residence on 2 separate days. So you go out on Monday and you go out on Friday and he's not home, or gone or whatever. Or if the owner occupant doesn't live in the municipality, then of course it's going to be harder to reach an agreement. Then you would go right to writing an order for whatever infestation of weeds you're dealing with. An order is essentially an ultimatum from the weed inspector saying this shall be done or this is going to be done, and there's no bargaining or whatever. It's going to be done essentially. Whether it's an agreement or an order, they're both legally binding documents. They're used for the eradication of prohibited or isolated noxious weeds, and the control of established noxious or nuisance weed infestations. They're used for permits or prohibiting transportation of contaminated machines. Maybe you know of somebody who's got a combine who's full of a certain weed species that's a prohibited or noxious weed, right? It could be an order for them not to move the combine or to clean it out in an extreme case. As well, a prohibition or purchase, sale or movement of contaminated material. Maybe there's contaminated bales in that contain a certain weed species that's noxious or nuisance. As well as prohibiting seeding a specific, or isolated noxious weeds or prohibited weeds as well. As well, they can provide more detail rather than less. So, more detail is better for an agreement or an order. We have some publications on weed control on our website, as well consulting, with myself or one of the regional specialists, or an agronomist or professional agrologist that you work with or are aware of and know and trust that could give you some good recommendations on appropriate weed control measures that need to be taken. And as well, I think for the most chances or the highest chances of success, you need to fit into the control measures. Need to fit with the agronomic practices of that owner occupant, where possible and where reasonable, as there's a higher chance of success in that situation. As well, an order would be considered served after 5 business days of it being served personally by the weed inspector if that owner lives in the municipality or outside of the RM but still within Saskatchewan, or of course with mailing or courier. If the owner occupant lives outside of Saskatchewan, then the administrator would immediately move to sending the order by mail or courier and adding 5 business days on the postmark of the mail order, essentially. Now, it's very important also as the weed inspector to follow up. So if the agreement or order isn't carried out to the satisfaction of the weed inspector, control measures may be taken appropriate to the situation. So 5 days after serving the agreement or order, in person by the weed inspector, or 10 days from the date of mailing, so 5 days for delivery, and giving them 5 days to take action. Of course, the municipality, if no action is taken and it's been more than reasonable, and they've been, they're not in contact with you, they're outside of the timelines, the municipality can of course step in and charge the landowner for control. For small parcels less than 1/4 hectare or 0.62 acres, it's a $400 flat rate. And for parcels larger than 0.25 hectares or 0.62 acres, up to $1,250 per hectare or part of a hectare, to a maximum of $10,000 per quarter section of land. As well, all pesticides, including herbicides, need to be applied appropriately by a licensed applicator. The appropriate class, appropriate to the situation. So An agricultural license would be used for agricultural land. An industrial vegetation management license would be for industrial uses, so roadsides, rail, oil and gas, other industrial sites, landscape for domestic areas, lawns, gardens, parks, and forestry for our wooded areas. And of course, the work that's being done, so if it's spraying or another means, needs to be checked that it's been completed properly. And of course, we'd like to see it certified by council or signed statement, and statement included with the invoice in the tax statement if you're adding it to that landowner's taxes. As well, reporting, so the weed inspector is to report annually to the municipality. The report to the administrator of the RM by November 1st of each year. Excuse me, then the administrator would forward that to Saskatchewan Agriculture by the end of the year. It's good for us to also just know what's going on in the RM for weed issues and what's being done. Of course, including in that report copies of any orders or agreements or a summary of them. So we have an idea as well, where are the weed issues or what's being done in this RM. Some hints for tips and tricks for a weed inspector report. So good things to include: general note on the state of weeds in the RM. New weeds that could be a threat. What are you seeing? What are you finding? RM maps with an overview of problems with problems or problem weeds and new weeds or new weeds in certain areas of the RM. Notes on programs underway at the municipal level. And as well, notes on weed control activities being organized. Maybe there's students to pick weeds and they'd like to know, which weeds as well that they're picking or what's going on. Excuse me, my voice is starting to get a little bit tickled here, or caused me to cough. But of course, on a weed inspector report, you don't need to include timesheets for mileage or expenses. If you have more than one weed inspector, one summary is fine. We don't need 6 individual reports from 6 different weed inspectors that are appointed in the RM. We kind of say no such thing as no noxious weeds because, if you're doing your job as a weed inspector, you're probably going to find some noxious weeds or some infestation, especially if you're out there and you're looking and you're doing your role. So, it's difficult when someone says there's no noxious weeds in the RM, when for the most part, I think in most, if not all RMs, there's some noxious weeds somewhere in the RM. So it might be indicative of somebody who, isn't completely aware of the Act or how the Act works or understanding it, or maybe just somebody who's not out monitoring as thoroughly as they need to be as a weed inspector. As well, detailed application records don't need to be in the report, but SARM will need them for any claims under the invasive plant control program to get your rebate money back, which we encourage people to absolutely use. As well, the annual report, it's an area where we kind of would allow weed inspectors to express any ideas or concerns that they have, right? It's also where you get to maybe, give input or make suggestions as to how to make the Act work better, or suggestions for, resources that you would need at the field level, where we can at least, have some input and consider what you're saying, essentially, rather than if we don't get any input to consider, then we just assume things are going well and don't, need to make changes necessarily. As well, preventing weed movement. So weeds can move through different mechanisms, right? Seeds, roots, stolons, stems. They can move by air, floating, drifting, by water, or with animals or humans, and a whole bunch of different ways, clothes, tires, undercarriage of vehicles, through hay, forage, feed, grain, soil, aggregates, seed, intentional introductions, right? Bouquets, ornamentals. So really preventing the introduction of new weeds is much easier, cost effective than trying to eradicate them once they're established. For example, a weed like field bindweed, the seed can last for up to 20 or 50 years in the soil, and the roots can survive for 2 years or more. Brownleaf mallow seed has been documented to last up to 125 years in the soil. So, and still counting. So Mother Nature has a lot of tricks up her sleeve for being hard to get under control, and she's hard to beat and get on top of. We'll put it that way. They've got a lot of different mechanisms and methods and ways, Mother Nature and weeds can use to become very hard to control and to deal with. So that's why we say getting it dealt with before it becomes very well established is a lot easier than dealing with it afterwards. I'm going to discuss a little bit about prohibited weeds. So a prohibited weed is a weed that's typically would be absent from Saskatchewan or very, very rare. The easiest time to address them is proactively. So again, as soon as they're found and identified, excuse me. So going back to the invasion cycle graph here, right? So if they're identified earlier on, we're able to eradicate them rather than maybe to going to a containment and control or coping, but also the economic return is stronger, even at a 25 to 1, right? So every dollar spent to control them returns $25 rather than a lower economic return. And they're a big problem to deal with then if they become very well established here. Of course, how our different weeds fit, right? Prohibited, noxious, and nuisance. I've reviewed that. So of course, what am I saying here? Excuse me. The easiest way to address these weeds is as soon as they are found and identified. It fits well with the early detection and rapid response concept where we detect them early, we're out there monitoring, we detect them early, and we move very quickly to control them or eradicate them. Like I showed on the graph there, the sooner a prohibited weed is found, the smaller the area to be impacted, and a larger return, right? It showed $25 for every dollar spent with the earlier graph here with the early detection and eradication, for example. And just to give some perspective, imagine if, say, 100 years ago, we'd addressed leafy spurge or resentless chamomile or a different weed species in this way. It would be a different situation for the extent of how much of a problem that those weeds or weed species are. All right, so we're going to discuss monitoring a little bit. So regular plant monitoring is critical to finding new infestations of weeds. So focusing, of course, on critical pathways of spread. That's most likely where we're going to find a prohibited weed. It should be checked first. Typically, these would be our rights of ways, roadways, utility rights of ways, where we have power, gas, telephone, water, railways, where we have a lot of different, people coming in and going out of the area, especially from different areas where they might be carrying weed seeds or, some part of the plant that there's a potential there for it to become established and grow and turn into seeds and spread. Waterways, which is one way that in Manitoba they've had Palmer amaranth and water moving in and becoming established. As well, grain elevators, feedlots, gravel pits, oil and gas facilities, really any location where there's quite a fair bit of human activity or movement of things in and out. As well, looking for noxious weeds at the same time. Neither prohibited or noxious weeds require a complaint to start enforcement. Excuse me. Only nuisance weeds do you need a complaint to actually start enforcement. Otherwise, with a prohibited or noxious weed, you can start enforcement as soon as that infestation is found and identified. You want to do your best to document your routes and what you found. So documenting, what roads you're driving on, where you're driving, GPS coordinates, very helpful as well, using IMAP invasives. It's good to record where those weed species are and for others to see as well. If you're lucky and all goes well, looking will be all that you do and you don't identify or find any prohibited weeds on your monitoring trips. I think this is one area too where ratepayer education might actually pay off, where informed ratepayers would likely also have some other eyes out there looking and keeping an eye out, and can make light work of monitoring for weeds, or can they bring up concerns, right, without having any hesitation to do so. We say to maybe hold ratepayer meetings or barbecues, but really or even adding on a weed control component at the end of the yearly RM meeting, right, or the ratepayer meeting, just again to keep ratepayers up to date and informed with what's going on in the RM for weed control and weed control activities. A bit of socializing and getting out there maybe does help with a good relationship with the weed inspector, with ratepayers, and I mean with the RM council as well, and other individuals involved with the RM. As well, we think most ratepayers would be on your side with controlling weeds, right? Reinforcing with what you're doing, and them wanting to live in an RM that has weeds under control and not a massive infestation. All right, so what do we do if a prohibited weed is found? So finding a prohibited weed. When you think you found a prohibited weed, you want to notify, of course, the RM office, the municipal office, the landowner. You want to locate that landowner if you don't know who they are, and of course us, the Crops and Irrigation Branch. We would like to know what that weed species is and where it's been found, and of course, if needed, to help eradicate it and control it. Do a very good job to document the location thoroughly and the boundaries of that weed infestation. Collecting samples for positive ID, which can be sent to the Crop Protection Lab for free. We'll do our best here to give it a positive, to correctly identify the weed species, as well as being careful. If you're not sure, maybe to wear gloves or to be careful how you're handling the weed, so you're not putting yourself at risk or harm. And of course, to send the samples in, we would recommend paper towel to keep them dry. And not in a plastic bag or container, because they'll overheat and deteriorate quite quickly. Also, for sending samples, something you don't want to do on like a Friday afternoon, because they're going to sit in the mail for a couple of days. Samples should be collected and sent, like a Monday or Tuesday at the beginning of the week, so we can get them and process them at a decent time, so they're not sitting and deteriorating in the mail or in storage. As well, we focus on eradication of the prohibited weed. So Section 30 of the Act states the weed inspector shall eradicate, or by notice require the owner or the occupant, to eradicate prohibited weeds using measures the weed inspector considers the most effective available. And of course, Section 23 states the weed inspector shall not issue an order requiring the destruction of a crop unless there is an infestation of a prohibited weed on that land. Of course, eradication, what is that? Well, it's basically killing all growing parts of the weed and rendering the reproductive mechanisms non-viable. So basically, killing it, making sure it can't go to seed and populate and have more of those, more of that weed species being present and spreading. We kind of call it a scorched earth policy, where we want them dead and gone. And of course, eradication, it might be a process where you need to continue to monitor and come back to that area and make sure that weed has been eliminated from that area, that landscape. It might be a few years of follow-up, or you might need to come back after herbicide application to make sure there aren't any skips or misses, for example. As well, it might be a good practice for a prohibited area bylaw, where the municipality may by law designate an area where prohibited weeds are found to be, right? So they could be a prohibited area, specifying a boundary distance around that weed infestation. It doesn't have to be that whole corridor of land, but maybe it needs to be 10 acres where the weed is found, right? We make, a border a little bit outside of the infestation and kind of mark off the area. And the prohibited area bylaw could remain in force for 5 years from the last occurrence of the weed at that site, just to make sure that there's not any stragglers and that we're exhausting that seed bank, so that we're being 110% certain that that prohibited weed is gone from that area. Of course, the municipality must notify the director, the Crops and Irrigation Branch, about the bylaw It would be good for the weed control specialist to know as well, so we know what's going on and what's happening, as well providing a copy of the bylaw to the landowner and occupant, so they know what's happening and going on their land, or why there's a fence being put up or an area being fenced off. As well, the weed inspector would monitor the site from May 1st to October 31st every year while the bylaw is in force. So again, it's a fair bit of work. You need to be out there doing your due diligence, monitoring the site every so many times a year from May 1st to October 31st for a few years, and treating any plants that emerge, or treat or or that the owner occupant treat under their direct supervision. So making sure that they're being, attempts are being made to kill or to control any plants that emerge, using the most effective measures available to eradicate the plant. So likely a herbicide application. As well, posting the boundary of the prohibited area with sufficient signs that somebody approaching the area could not miss, so that they know it's a prohibited area because of a prohibited weed occurrence. The weed inspector may erect a safe barrier to prevent the entry of livestock or people, again, just around that infestation area, not the whole corridor of land, for example, making the area very noticeable that it is a fenced off prohibited area. May prohibit the movement of any person, machine, or animal in and out of that prohibited area. May order the destruction of the crop if necessary, or prohibit the seeding excuse me, of the crop of a crop in that area until the weed species is 100% certain that it's under control and been eradicated. A couple of caveats to this as well. So the appeal process still applies to prohibited weeds, suggesting that you notify the landowner occupant as soon as possible and being in contact with them on all actions being taken. So again, identifying the identification of the weed, what actions are being taken, and keep them in the loop and help them understand what's going on as the weed inspector. As well, of course, Section 20 states that as the weed inspector, you have to do this. As well, appeals do protect the landowner from negligence in case there's an improper identification. So again, confirmation of the identification of the weed is critical. Improper notification as well for protecting the landowner. So again, jumping to an order without maybe offering an agreement. The appeal can only be sought after an order has been issued. And conflict of interest due to counselors acting as enforcement officers as well can be one, just one thing to be aware of. All right, also going to note here that offenses apply to all weeds equally. No added fines or no more severe penalties over noxious or nuisance weeds. Just remembering, it's not an offense to be the unlucky enough person to have to actually, excuse me for my voice here, have that prohibited weed on your property to deal with it, and to be the person who has to go through the process now to have it dealt with and eradicated and dealt with. So that's basically the basics of the enforcement of the Weed Control Act. And I thought I would just touch a little bit on a weed inspector guidance document that we've kind of made up here. It's going through the approval process with my management and director here, but I thought I could just add a couple of pieces from the document to help address some potential conflicts or issues that we do come by. So number one, the document talks about the role of the weed inspector and the applicator, which I've covered. And it also addresses when we have a potential or a conflict of interest where you have an RM counselor appointed as a weed inspector. So we think it's also valuable to maybe have some, some strategies to minimize or manage any conflicts that might be there. And of course, one way might be the RM conflict of interest policy that can be expanded to, to discuss or include some discussion about this. As well, if you're dealing with a weed infestation on land that is owned or occupied by the the counselor and they're appointed as the weed inspector, or it's a family member or a close friend of that of that counselor, excuse me, of that counselor, it might be good to bring in a weed inspector from a neighboring RM to reduce or eliminate any bias that might be, um, you know, that might come up and might really impede the full, controlling of the weeds on the land, right? Because that's the end goal, is the weed inspector. You're there to enforce the act and control any regulated weeds. As well, if the counselor wishes to, they could provide a notice of their conflict of interest and recuse themselves of dealing with the matter, which would be great if they would be willing to do that. And then, of course, finding a neighboring weed inspector from a neighboring RM or area, or someone else who's qualified and capable to help manage the situation. So, to help manage the weeds in that situation. As well, we feel it's a very good practice, whether the weed inspector is an RM counselor that's been appointed or just who's been appointed in the RM. It's a good practice, we feel, for that weed inspector to show the RM council what steps they're taking to control weeds on their own land. So again, showing the accountability piece, and also, making sure you've got a tried and true weed inspector there who they're doing the best to control weeds in the RM, but also showing that what they're doing on their own land, whether it's a few quarters of land or some pasture or hay or cropland or in their yard, I think it really does show the accountability and really does show that you've got someone there who's really does care and doing a good job. So with that, we kind of covered enforcement enforcement of the Weed Control Act, and touching a little bit on this weed inspector guidance document that will be available on our website once it's approved here, hopefully rather quickly. But for any information on weed inspectors, if you're looking for any information, the forms, agreements, the map, we would say to go to saskatchewan.ca and in the search bar, just search weed inspectors, or even just Google weed inspectors gov of SK. That should take you there. We'll have the forms, for orders and agreements. This weed inspector document will be up there once I get it approved in hopefully several weeks or a month. And any other information about weed inspectors, applicators, it's got quite a fair bit of information on it to help guide you as a weed inspector. But other than that, I've got my my contact information there in my email, and I'm happy to answer or help deal with any questions that anybody might have. Or I entertain emails at any time as well, because we're here to help. But I'm also, being pretty new in the role, I'm also learning a fair bit as we go too. So I don't always have the answers, but work to find them. So with that, that's my presentation, and I'll entertain any questions or comments anybody has about this, or anything you've got to add, Katie, or any of the PHTAs.
Right on. Thank you so much, Corey. That was great. I know I'm going to be referring back to that. I'll probably end up printing it out and just keeping it with my stuff. So, and just to remind everyone out here that all of our presentations from our webinars are going to be available on the SARM website. And there's even past webinars up there too, if you want to go through. There's some really good information from the past years. So we can start on some questions. There are a few here. The first one is from Melissa, and it says, what if you issue an order by email to an oil field company? Is it still the 5 days that would be required normally through an order?
So my question back to her would be, have she talked to the oil field company in person? I'm assuming that they operate outside of her RM. I would say that if their headquarters is outside of that RM, then it would still be, of course, give them 5 days for it to make it there, and then 5 days for them to take action. I think that's how it would take place. If I've got that wrong, Melissa, let me know, or please shoot me an email if I'm misunderstanding your question.
Awesome. That seems reasonable. Next one is from Doug. It says, in this presentation, it's stated that a weed inspector applying chemical required an industrial vegetation license. Are they also required to have an agricultural vegetation license?
I would say yes, if they want to apply any pesticides. You need to be licensed to handle them and to apply them. Just, to be on the safe side and make sure you've got the proper training. And it's going to depend, like I'd mentioned there's different types of licenses for landscape or agricultural or industrial. So it just depends, which one you're focused on there, or if you want to broaden your scope.
Yeah, it's always good to be prepared to have both licenses, especially since a lot of our weed control is directly adjacent to cropland or RM land. It's nice to have both. Our next question is from John. When a prohibited weed is adjacent to the patch being eradicated is on Crown land, what is the approach to the problem?
So it's not an easy approach. I would say it's contacting whoever owns that Crown land, whatever Crown that is, and getting on them. And I would also say you could get us involved, because we state the Crown isn't bound by the legislation, but they need to take accountability for controlling the weeds on their land. So I think it does start with having a good relationship, but good discussion with whoever it is, whichever manager or person that's there, to say it's a prohibited weed, it needs to be dealt with. And we don't mind getting involved either from our side to help with educating as well, because we've had lots of discussions, questions come up around this about prohibited weed control on Crown land. Some of the Crowns don't know, they're quite in the dark from our discussions as to how they go about it. But from our experiences, the majority of the Crowns, they want to do the right thing. I think they're just not aware, or it's not being communicated somewhere, but they should be controlling it, because it just is going to spread onto the RM land or whoever's land, and it's just going to be a never-ending issue.
So Corey, who would they contact if there is a problem on Crown land?
It's going to depend who that Crown person, if it's Sask Energy, or it's just going to depend which Crown that is, and then pathfinding to find who the right person is. And I wish I had a better answer than that.
Yeah, it can be a tricky one.
It can be, if it's highways, finding that local manager. They can come to us and we can try to pathfind, but it's just finding who's the responsible person, that has the authority to actually control the weeds or make some calls or shots.
Great. Our next question is just asking, where can we find a copy of the weed inspector guidance document? That one is not available yet, am I right?
That's correct. It's in the approvals for my manager and director. It'll probably have to go through communications branch, but I'm hoping within the next month or so it'll be, if you just Google Weed Inspectors Gov of SK, I'm hoping it'll be up on the website in the next month or so.
Perfect. Why are the Crown corporations exempt?
I don't have a good answer for that question. To be 100% honest with you, when we're actually looking to open up and change the act, we're looking at changing the language around the Crowns being exempt. So it's one thing we're looking at, basically, not removing the exemption, but putting some accountability back to them. I don't know why it was ever exempt or why that was in there, but we've had a lot of internal discussions around it, and it is something we're looking at when the act is opened up, because it is a large issue. And I get a lot of questions around it, and I think it's something changing the wording would help to deal with the issue.
Okay. Our next question is from Norbert. He says, where can I find a list of noxious weeds?
So Norbert, it should be, if you Google the Weed Control Act, it should come up as one of the lists of weeds, so you'll have the Weed Control Act, you'll have access to the regulations, and as well, it should provide the list of weeds for the noxious, nuisance, and prohibited weeds. It should be in the act if it's on the on the government website. I can't remember what the portal is called, but it should be available there.
Okay. And if you need a hand with any of that, Norbert, just let one of the plant health technical advisors know, and we can line you up with the right document.
Yeah.
Our next question, and so far the last question, if there is absinthe on RM right-of-way and organic fields nearby, does the RM still have the right to spray their own land? Organic owner does not want any spray near their land, but RM council wants it to be sprayed.
That's a tough one. To keep everybody happy, it might be best to try to work with that organic producer as much as possible. You know, if push comes to shove and it's not getting controlled after trying to work with that organic producer, it might have to be done. But I would try to work as much as possible to accommodate, you know, everybody around it or the stakeholders like the organic producer to work to keep them happy. You know, pulling, mowing, trying to prevent using a herbicide if at all possible. And if that's been more than a reasonable effort and you still can't get it under control after trying for a few years, then it might just have to be done and ordered. And it's not going to be pretty dealing with somebody who's got organic certification, but I don't know how else you deal with that situation easily.
Yeah. And just a follow-up question to that from Brian, is the organic producer not required to have their own buffer zone?
I don't know about that. For certified seed, they have to have a buffer zone. For organic, I'd have to talk to somebody who knows more about that than I do. I'm not sure what the regulations are, or the rules around their certification.
Okay. As far as I know, like I've looked into this a couple times, and as far as I know, the weed inspector or the organic farmer is required to have their own buffer zone. A lot of them end up using RM right of way just to extend their own, I guess you could say, buffer zone. But yeah, this might have to be a question that we look up a little further. Our last question. Okay. Yes, last question. Do Crowns have the ability to appoint RM weed inspectors?
No, that's only the RM.
Okay.
The RM has the authority there. The Crown doesn't have any authority to appoint a weed inspector in the RM.
Okay. Okay, so that is our last question. Thanks again, Corey. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you coming on today. Just want to give a plug for a few upcoming events that we have. We've got a pest control officer webinar tomorrow, which is on integrated pest management for rodent control. So if there's any PCOs in the crowd that haven't registered for it yet, please feel free to do that. We've also got some weed inspector workshops coming up this spring. Our first one is in Regina on April 1st. Our second one is April 2nd in Saskatoon. Similar to last year, they're going to be the same thing both days, so you can pick either or workshop. We should be putting those registration details out hopefully by the end of this week, so you should see more details on that soon. I think that's it. Thanks again for attending, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us today, and stay warm out there.
Thank you.